develop principles. Now, before you observe a teacher's class, and you can't make sense of a teacher's class unless you know what are the principles that teacher's working from. I mean, they might be principles derived from some method, so they might be, for example, using a task-based approach or a communicative approach or some other approach which has principles associated with it. Or they might be teaching from their own personal philosophy of teaching, drawing on what they've learned from training and so on, but built up through experience. So you can't really make sense of it unless you observe, unless you know what the teacher's principles are. So before I observe a teacher's class, I will try to have the opportunity to sit down and say, well, you know, what are some of the things that you believe should go on in a class of this kind? How do you approach this particular class? What sort of teaching do you try to realize in this conversation class? And the teacher might say, well, you know, my main principle is get them talking, or my main principle is let them have fun, or whatever. So you can't make a sense of practice until you know what the principle is behind that practice. And of course, when we train teachers, we start out teaching them techniques, but they're really just the starting point, because techniques mean nothing unless there's some principles behind them. Otherwise, it's just a bunch of recipes that don't really have any intellectual coherence or substance. Anybody can pull out recipe books and say, try this activity, it's fun, but you know, what is that activity actually trying to do? Why is it useful in teaching reading or in teaching writing? Sometimes when I ask teachers to talk about their principles, I get some unexpected and insightful comments. Now, this serve the common good. Kathy Bailey's written about this principle from some of the research on teaching that she has done, and the teacher who articulated this principle, who didn't put it in these particular words, basically said that when I teach, all the students have different interests and different problems, and I can't give too much time to this particular student's problem unless it's also of relevance to the other students in the class. So the teacher who articulated that principle was saying that she tries to negotiate a focus for the lesson that's going to be relevant to as many students as possible, and so that's what she calls serve the common good. So then that would make sense of how the teacher responds to students' concerns and needs and so on, and how she gives time to some activities and not to others. I like this one. This was a lady in China, and when we were talking about principles, and she immediately said that this was one of her important principles, and I like that idea, that she doesn't accept the idea that students are failures or will fail. So she tries to work, when I asked her to talk about what this means, she tried to explain how she'll spend time with students both in class and out of class who don't have a lot of confidence, who don't seem to think they're making progress, and trying to build up students' confidence. That's a nice principle. Every learner is a winner, so that she's not going to let students fall behind. As you know, in a language class, after a couple of months, there are some students who seem to be falling behind and some who seem to be getting ahead. So her concern is with those students who are falling behind, how can she help get them back on board? This one was an interesting one. It might sound kind of strange. The teacher who was telling me this about this philosophy was saying that he feels that the classroom is a kind of artificial environment in which to learn. You know, with people sitting at desks and things. He said, you know, when people come to his house, they are free to move about, to help themselves to things, to sit where they like and so on. He said he tries to build that same atmosphere into his classroom. So he's articulating a principle that will presumably shape seating arrangements, teacher-student interaction, activities, choices over the things they want to do, and so on. Now these, of course, are not principles you'd get from a methodology course, are they? These are personal principles, really, based on your own personal learning philosophy. Accommodate students' learning styles, follow the learner's interest to maintain involvement. So, in teacher development, it's important to try to have the opportunity to articulate and think about one's principles, compare one's principles with others through activities that involve group planning, Group lesson planning or paired lesson planning is a very useful professional development activity, because when you are working on a lesson together with someone, you have a chance to actually think about, well, I would do it this way, why? Oh, I would do it that way. And then you begin to think, oh, well, maybe the principles that I'm using are actually constricting me in some way, or not. There are other ways of doing it. So activities that involve reflecting on and thinking about the principles one is using, and whether those principles are really the best ones. The last principle that I'm talking about is teach reflectively, and that notion is based on the idea that development as a teacher is based on not simply experience. Of course, there's a lot of things that experience gives us a wider repertoire of strategies, for one thing. It gives us a better knowledge of students, gives us more confidence. So there's a lot of things that experience gives us. On the other hand, people sometimes say 10 years experience can also be 1 year's experience repeated 10 times. So you have the question of people just teaching from a very restricted set of principles that haven't changed much. The notion of reflectivity argues that we can learn from our experience best if we have opportunities to think about it, to reflect on it. So reflective teaching simply means teaching accompanied by exploration, really. Opportunities to examine what one's doing, think about it, ask questions about it, and use that process as a way of reviewing and assessing where one is in one's professional development. So these kinds of questions that can be the focus of peer observation, it can be the focus of maybe having a video made of one of your lessons, could be the focus of a journal writing experience or whatever.